Hello and welcome back to another episode of Pragmatic Optimists. My name is Tiara Mack. I am a state senator and I'm joined by Rachel Cohen, who is an attorney. And we are here to talk about the two executive orders passed last week on July 24th related to homelessness and bringing back forced institutionalization, because this is the America that we live in. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share on Legal AF. We are also the Pragmatic Optimist found on that chat platform. And thank you to Midas Touch for keeping us within the family. Rachel, I saw this headline announcement and I was like, this is exactly where I thought the United States was going. We have seen the ICE budget rival the next 14 nations in the world. We have seen cop cities proliferate throughout all of our communities. And now we have, with, I believe it was last year, it's hard to keep up with the timelines, Johnson versus Grants Pass, which allowed homeless people or people experiencing homelessness to be ticketed and potentially sent to prisons. And now we're going to see that at a national scale. And there are so many other things happening at the same time that I hope we're able to connect the dots for people. Housing is quite simply out of reach for the vast majority of Americans. Minimum wages have not kept up. And so most people are not able to work 40 hours a week on a federal minimum wage job or even a state minimum wage job, which is oftentimes much higher than the federal minimum wage, and be able to afford basic things like shelter. We have also seen in recent years private equity literally gobble up the abundance of available housing that we've had. But the numbers have been confusing. The numbers have been concerning. And the headlines for the last few years have really led us to this moment where we have a rising authoritarian who wants to continue to use fear and labor to keep a population in check. And that comes at the expense of our fellow neighbors and community members who are now going to be criminalized simply for the act of not being able to afford the world that was bought and sold and procured through Donald Trump being in office for his billionaire benefactors. So I know that is a lot to start off our show on a series of things that are wrong with this moment. But Rachel, as always, we are going to wrap up with what keeps us optimistic. But let's dive into this news story and into this these two executive orders that have led us to where we are today.
Absolutely. I think that there's so much to unpack there, and sometimes I can start to feel a little bit tinfoil hat-y. But I think that one of the reasons why things are quite successful here is because we have convinced a bunch of people that actually it's like overly conspiracy theory to look at the government, which is currently that it has this huge and has over decades built out an apparatus for detention without access to due process rights and protections of people as they are accused of, I mean, sometimes crimes. And now we're looking at just accusations of being mentally ill or otherwise incapable of taking care of oneself. We've seen that apparatus built out in both criminal and civil commitment kind of structures. We've seen a government that, regardless of party, is very happy to detain immigrants, people who are across the board. Just, I always want to shout this from the rooftops. Entering without inspection is a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense. And so you have people that are detained for civil offenses and building this out, making us all comfortable with it, associating the idea of migration and illegal immigration with Latino people when there are plenty of Europeans that are overstaying their visas, white people from all over the world that are overstaying their visas and that are entitled in ways that the vast majority of Latino immigrants are not. And so seeing all of this built out, seeing a war waged on trans people in this country, and then also seeing executive orders talking about how we should be able to detain people who are mentally ill, that's something that I don't want to get too far afield, but that I think about constantly is this rhetoric about mental illness levied at trans people. And so then to see an executive order expanding civil commitment for people that are mentally ill, that sets off alarm bells for me. And we may not get to that point, and I hope that we don't, because people show out and they don't allow that to happen to their neighbors. But I think that if the American people get tired and we stop resisting and we stop forcing people to care about the humanity in each individual person, it would not surprise me at all if the Trump administration starts moving towards expanding what gets you civilly confined. And I think that this is an apparatus that allows even things like political dissent, right? And that sounds alarmist. And I know that there will be people that tell me that sounds alarmist. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying, this is what's coming tomorrow, but I think that this is long term. What really, really scares me about things like this is that the Trump administration is defining its own understanding of mental illness at a time where it is also trying to institutionalize the mentally ill. And I think I want to come back and really focus on the housing and homelessness piece, but I want to make one more point before we dive into that as kind of the meat of our program today, which is that, and I didn't know this until last year, a law school acquaintance of mine came and spoke at my old employer about disability rights work that she was doing and told me that Illinois still has a sprawling civil commitment institutionalization system, which shocked me because this is a true blue state. I always say to people, like I have it pretty good. Like I live in one of the only states where I feel pretty confident that rights are being protected. And I think it's a reminder that even when you have somebody like Pritzker in charge, who is somebody that I do generally speak quite highly of, who I think is really rising to meet the moment, we have a system built out in the United States that, even when we are not led by an authoritarian, needs an immense amount of work to prioritize humanity in each person, even when they do not kind of cookie cutter fit the mold of what we think of as a person who is successful, who, is self-sufficient or whatever else. And it matters that we advocate for each and every one of those groups.
Mm-hmm.
Because as soon as we allow one group of people to be dehumanized, it is a gateway drug to dehumanization broadly. And so I want to turn to kind of the way that we demonize people who are unhoused, and would love to hear kind of your experiences on advocacy. And then we can come back, because I know, as you're aware, I actually worked on a team that filed an amicus brief in Grants Pass, and feel very comfortable in talking through those things and the terrifying potential futures that arise from the Supreme Court's decision there.
Yeah, well, Rachel, I forgot about like two other crazy things that happened last week because there's just been so much. I want to briefly touch on, you mentioned that the attacks on trans people, there's so many dots that we can connect, and we might sound like crazy tin hat people, but I think it's really important that last week, I believe, and I saw just the like TikToks and memes on this, I need to do a little bit more work on investigating, but I really wanted to focus on our work for the homelessness. But last week, the administration also removed the B from LGBTQ plus. So there is a systemic erasure of communities, or a scapegoating of communities. We've seen it with the trans community, trying to paint these people as mentally ill, the forced institutionalization of the homeless population as exclusively mental ill or people facing addiction, which we also have seen. I want to commend the work that is happening at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We'll have some resources from them as well, because they have a really great fact book and a couple of one pagers and graphs to really highlight this experience. But we know that people are more likely to experience mental health disorders and addiction after they become unhoused, not before. They become unhoused and their conditions exacerbate and or start at that point. I think it's also important to note that the most vulnerable group to experience homelessness or housing insecurity are our older citizens. They are your grandmamas, your granddaddies, and people who are older. And to paint this housing crisis as anything but a manufactured housing crisis, because we have private equity and billionaires who have seen a new frontier of passive income and passive extraction of wealth from communities. It's really hard not to connect those dots. The systemic redlining of communities, the power grabs on both city councils at the municipal level and at the state level of the realtor lobby in order to purchase land and purchase homes purely to build a rental apparatus to keep people from ownership in their communities. We have also seen over the last like 2, 3 decades, probably even more, the removal of federal incentives for building publicly owned housing, which is a very common model in Europe. Another set of developed nations have primarily publicly owned housing. And in our country, because we saw it as a tool to build up the middle class and to incentivize people who were Black and what used to be the minoritized white people who have now become white in our country, the Irish, the Polish, and Russians in our communities who were not considered white when they first immigrated to this country, but have since been assimilated into being seen as white. And oh my God, there's just so many ways. It is also impossible to extract this conversation about housing and affordability without combining that with wages and labor, and how the working class people in our country, the people who literally keep our country running, do not have the wages necessary to keep up with the world that the elites are building. Mobile homes have been one of the hotbeds of procurement for private equity. Lots of mobile home parks. The land is owned by a single person, and the individual home that someone, a manufactured home that someone has on top of that land, is what they rent. And as private equity buys those huge lots, the rates and rents go up. And so many people experience homelessness or housing insecurity because they were not able to keep up with the increased rents on those mobile homes. In metropolitan areas, in some of the largest cities across our country, wages have also not been able to keep up. 18 out of 50 states now have a minimum wage, or the minimum wage that you need in order to be able to afford a 2-bedroom home is over $30. And I believe there's only one state, and I'll make sure we get this graphic up on the screen at some point. I believe there are only 6 states where you are able to make under $20 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom home. So while we're talking about homelessness, we must always talk about the fact that the federal minimum wage has been kept at $7.25 an hour, mainly because of racism in our country, but also because of classism. And states have done the work over the last few years to increase the minimum wage, but there is no state where the state minimum wage is enough to be able to afford the rental income, and housing prices across our country are way too high. And so while we're talking about homelessness, we must always be talking about wages. We must also be talking about the work that we deem as worthy in our country, because there are so many people, restaurant workers, blue collar workers, and folks who are working to literally build the cities in which people live, who are not able to afford to live in the homes that they are buying, that they are plumbing, and that they're doing the HVAC on.
And that's such a helpful and like sprawling summary of the many causes of this that I think you accurately summarized down to. It all comes back to racism and classism, like this exploitative racial capitalism that our country is founded on. And so it can feel very sprawling because there's so many different things to talk about and so many different causes, but there's one root cause, and that is attempting to create a class of people that it is functionally like an American aristocracy in a way that is deeply connected to race in the United States, and to have a bunch of people that are viewed as less deserving who do not get to participate. And so I think that this kind of hoarding of resources, and it's ultimately nonsensical, because at the same time I was thinking about, your 2-bedroom home statistic, and this is at the same time that the government is trying to both incentivize and coerce people into having more children, whether they want them or not, that we're talking constantly about declining birth rates. And then the last kind of, sometimes because we're online, if we interject, it cuts off, which is why we go back and forth in little stints in this way. But were we sitting in the same room, another place that I would have interjected is on the notion of, when you're talking about the way that we devalue specific people's labor, it just immediately took me back to the quarantine era of the pandemic, when we saw who's actually essential for society to function. And I can tell you this much, it is not corporate attorneys. It's not. And so all of that to say, I think that's a really helpful starting point to talk about the causes of homelessness, because I think that that's important when we then talk about the way that we are demonizing it. And so that takes us into Grants Pass, which I can give a little bit of background on. It's functionally in the Ninth Circuit, which is out west and covers places like California and Idaho. There was, for a period of time, functionally a moratorium on enforcing laws that made it illegal for people to sleep or camp in public. And when we talk about camping, the way that it made its way up to the Supreme Court, it was constantly focused on things that were called anti-camping ordinances, which caused people to think about, people that are pitching tents or similar, which does very much exist. But these laws covered things like sleeping outside in a sleeping bag, like sleeping outside with a pillow. It was something like any accoutrement other than just like being by yourself. So it would cover, I don't know about you, but when I go to, I live in Chicago, so there's a lot of beach access, especially for, 4 months out of the year when it's warm enough to use it. And we'll go and bring our blankets or our towels or take a little nap out there. And that would be technically covered by a lot of these anti-camping ordinances. And so there were a number of court orders that said, or court decisions at the Ninth Circuit level that said, if you have these anti-camping ordinances, but you don't have shelter beds for people, then this is cruel and unusual punishment, because this is a crime of existing. And it relied significantly on a case that made it illegal to criminalize status crimes. Like the law at question was a Texas law that made it illegal to be an addict. And there was no requirement that that person be actively using. There was no requirement that that person be possessing drugs. It was just, if you are an addict, you can go to jail. And so status crimes are illegal. And there was an argument that came from that saying it is a status to be unhoused. Like, where else are you supposed to go? You are simply existing if there are not adequate shelter beds. And so this line of cases made it such that the vast majority of large cities out west were not enforcing, or in the Ninth Circuit, were not enforcing anti-camping ordinances. And so there was all of this discourse around tent cities. It was leaned into not just by people on the right, but also by people on the left. Gavin Newsom once staged a photo op when Grants Pass banned these, when Grants Pass went back to allowing these anti-camping ordinances to be implemented, staged a photo op of himself dismantling someone's home, like tearing down tents and
that.
Tents. And I will be talking about this constantly, not because I think he's doing very good work, but that to me is indicative not of him specifically, but again of the fault that I think we talk about a lot in failing to center humanity in our politics. Because I understand that it is not only an eyesore, but really a potential public safety issue for people who are unhoused at times to be living in encampments that are open to the elements in a time of rapidly increasing climate change, et cetera. And that's what the Trump administration's executive order focuses on, right? Is that they don't want things like needle exchanges. They don't want things like housing above all kind of infrastructure. And what they want instead is kind of tough policies that make it so that if you're drug addicted, you have to get clean before you get in. These policies are what cause homelessness, and they are what cause people to die. And so we all have the same goal of getting people out of unsafe situations on the street and into housing. We do, but, or we all claim we have the same goal. I know that that's actually my goal. But when we see the policies that are being implemented, not just by the Trump administration, but by some Democrats that are really seizing on this idea of the homeless population as an unpopular population that they can scapegoat to show how tough they are and how they care about cleaning up our streets and whatever else, those kind of tough punitive policies have nothing to do with actually getting people housed. I had a conversation with a friend recently where she said it's, if you really, really hate homeless people and you really hate seeing them and you never want to be around them, you should be a socialist because you should, the easiest way to make that happen and the cheapest way to make it happen is to have policies that prioritize housing. And so I would like if those policies were motivated by people caring about individual humanity and other people. But even if that's not where you're at and your dehumanization is so baked in that you don't see an issue with the dehumanization of homeless people, you should still want them to have housing, because what we're doing instead is just putting them in jail, which is more destabilizing, makes it more likely that they will be unable to get jobs if they are released, and ultimately exacerbates the problem that it claims it's trying to solve.
Yeah. There's so many things, and I wish we were like just like in each other's living rooms right now, because we would just be like riffing off of each other. One, if the humanity piece doesn't get to you, and maybe this is just because I imagine that everyone else who doesn't believe in humanity just has like a Monopoly Man monocle on their eye, and it's just like walking around with like pockets full of cash and evil laughter. But it is more expensive to keep people in jails. We are building more and more prisons, and we have a less willing population of lowly educated high school graduates who are willing to do the hard and brutal work of being a correctional officer. So more of those people are making six-figure salaries simply because of overtime, and they are working in unsafe conditions because they are working 4 back-to-back shifts in order to make $100 to $150 an hour to end up making $200,000 plus dollars a year to work in the US prisons. It's also single-handedly one of the reasons why some of Trump's biggest backers are in the private prison industry, because they know that under his policies, more people will go to prisons using your taxpayer dollars, your hard-earned dollars that should be keeping children fed, building more public parks and building more public infrastructures, and not parks that have anti-homeless architecture built into them, like bars on benches, or removing all benches and places for people to sit, or fountains that have spikes on them so no one can lay down and put a mattress. But real public infrastructure that incentivizes people being able to walk and save money on not having to own a car and the expenses of having car insurance. And then to get to the dehumanization part, I think one of the most devastating things I have seen and heard after someone has had an encampment cleared, and I'm trying not to cry, is they have had their mother's ashes, a handwritten note from their parents, and photos. These are people's literal homes that are being torn apart. So to see someone like Gavin Newsom, this was like years ago, or could have been recently, destroy an encampment because someone who has been forced into homelessness, because these are not people who did not have homes before. These are people who did have homes. And because of rising costs of rent, because of eviction, which is the leading cause of homelessness, and the most likely person to experience homelessness in our country is not the person that is addicted, is not the person that is lazy. It is a child. It is a child, because a single mom who is working 2 to 3 jobs in order to keep a roof over her head, who ends up getting evicted because she has a health crisis, or because she loses one of those jobs, or because one of her kids gets sick and she has to stay home. That is the person who is experiencing homeless in our country. It is the person over 55 who can no longer work, who was a former blue collar worker working and no longer can because of disability or because of an injury, and is no longer able to put their body on the line to, again, keep our country running in our factories and our mill towns and in the essential work at grocery stores on their feet. Those are the people who are more likely to be homeless in our country. And to hear that when we clear encampments and we give people tickets, that all of their worldly possessions, their parents' ashes, the only photo they have of their children, a handwritten letter with "I love you" from someone that they care about who is no longer here, that is what those people lose every time we clear an encampment. And that is the dehumanization, that these are people who have loved ones. These are people who have personal affects. These are people who deserve housing. And we have built a society that has told us that they don't have it because they were bad, they were lazy, and they were wrong, and not because we built a system where eviction puts people on the pathway to housing instability. We built a system where a minimum wage job, you need to be working at least 119 hours in order to be able to afford a 2-bedroom home in this country. That is the dehumanization and the prioritization of the wealthy over people who, again, literally build our communities, who are your neighbors, who are your friends, who are more likely to be someone that you know than someone that you don't. And we can put a nice, pretty bow on it. We can try to appeal to people's basic morality and basic sense of what is right and what is wrong, of justice versus injustice. But when we can't look someone in the face, one of those precious people who we are saying are criminals, and believe that they need a place to stay in all of our communities, that's when I failed to be able to continue harping on the financial aspect of it. Is yes, it is cheaper for us to build and sustain publicly owned housing than it is to have everyone own their own home. This idea that on stolen land that you can own a parcel of it, but then still have to pay taxes back to a state because of your ownership of it, is pretty bizarre to me. But if the humanity and the sad and stark reality that there are people on these streets because of the decisions every day that happen at the local municipal level and the state level and the federal level doesn't call you to action, I hope it's reading and listening to the stories of people who have experienced homelessness and housing insecurity, because that's what keeps me motivated at the state level, knowing that there is something I can do every single day, whether it is addressing more protections for tenants and having so many robust supports to keep people housed, whether it is ensuring that we are increasing minimum wages at the municipal level and at the state level, and encouraging our federal delegations to increase the federal minimum wage so that people have a just wage. And whether it's making sure that we are building systems and supports for workers, restaurant workers, the working class, because when we have wages that don't keep up with means, we also have small business owners that are going to be impacted. These are the mom and pop shops that we need to be going to more. We had a segment on boycott and divestment and sanctioning earlier, or the BDS movement, but going to your local mom and pop shop is going to be more fruitful to keep the dollars right inside of your community. And you cannot keep the dollars inside of community if you are spending the majority of your income on rent. And so the people who suffer most are restaurant workers. I have people in my community that own small restaurants who've also said that they're impacted because rents are too high and people are going out to dinner less, which means tips are down, wages are down, and staffing is down. And I've gone off on a huge tangent right now, Rachel, and I know we've been gabbing for a minute, but I want to ask you, what is keeping you optimistic? Because I was almost near tears thinking about all the people that I've come into contact with, but I am so hopeful that there are people who are enraged by this moment, who are enraged by these executive orders. And I have so much hope that with even just a little bit of action, we can turn the tides and ensure that every single person in our communities has a right to housing.
Yeah, I think there's two things that are keeping me optimistic right now. And the first is getting out of my house. And I know that that's not always accessible in the same ways to everyone in this moment. But I do think that engaging with mutual aid, which I think is where a lot of the most important work related to supporting the unhoused population is happening, engaging with mutual aid, and even just going out to the small businesses that we're talking about and sitting not with my headphones in and having conversations with people out in public. I think it really, what keeps me optimistic is seeing our capacity for human interaction. And I think that when we are staring at screens all day long, it can be really easy to forget that, because we're not interacting, we're not seeing feedback, we're not engaging with each other in the way that we really need as people. And so I don't want Popak to be mad at me for saying like log off and stop watching videos at some point. But I do think that going out into the world is what always keeps me optimistic. And the second thing is, and I am going to make sure that this comes up on our screen, but also I'm sending to you right now. I had a nice conversation with our number one fan, my mother, earlier this weekend, or excuse me, yesterday. And she has been designing merch for us and was so excited about it that she was like, I can't wait until they come in. They're coming in August 11th. So you and I have t-shirts coming, apparently, as does she and
Oh my
your
God.
if you'd like them. So these are not yet for sale. They're up on screen. But I think that the general optimism that I'm taking from here is the way that we support each other within community. And it's been really cool to see how things like the use of the term praggies, which she loves, are resonating with people, and also just in general, getting to have conversations with people, both that I know in real life or have known since conception in real life, or people that I'm meeting for the first time in our comments section, which we do read and really deeply enjoy hearing from y'all. So like, subscribe, to Legal AF at Midas Touch. You can follow Tiara and I on personal social medias at Cohen489 and Mack District 6 number. And thanks for tuning in while we discuss the horrors and then also hopefully leave you with a little bit of optimism.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.